So hi everybody, it's Steve Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to continue our discussion on various learning models and how they overlay on the change grid. Last time we were together, we began a discussion on the Herman Brain Dominance instrument. So joining us today is Anne Herman, and is it Nettie? Is that the last?
That's correct. My husband no longer takes offense to mispronunciation, so we're good.
and Joseph has gotten used to us mispronouncing his first name, so it all works out. So Anne, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, give people a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I'm actually the third generation leader of a company called Herman. Our second generation leader, I should say. My son is the third generation leader, and daughter of the creator of the Herman Brain Dominance instrument, Ned Herman, one of three daughters, and have been working with this. I actually lived overseas for about 15 years in France, where I, kind of got away from the work because I grew up on it. I used to come home from school and get wired up to the EEG for testing after school as part of my dad's research. So some people say that explains how I turned out. That's probably for you to judge. Anyway, so we've been working with this model now. Gosh, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And the model was originally developed at General Electric Corporation. It was actually funded by GE. And initially, believe it or not, when my father was head of management education, they were really trying to unpack learning. And you had asked me a question in our previous call about how does this ever get associated with learning? And it was actually initially looking at trying to understand what was happening in the heads of those who were sitting in the hallowed classrooms of the Crotonville Learning Center and at GE. And so it started with looking at insights in terms of what was going on in people's brains. And that included learning and thinking, but it became very clear that through a lot of the initial research of the initial testing, that they needed to move beyond wiring people up to the EEG as he could his daughters and friends and so on and so forth, to looking at a better way to codify what became clear were the thinking patterns in people's mental processes. And so the model that emerged is the whole brain thinking model. You have an example of that model there in front of you. And it's a metaphoric model for how the brain works. It is not at all intended to represent the oversimplification of left brain, right brain, which some people did get very excited about in the early research days of looking at the brain. And it's more of a way to understand to what degree do we develop preferences for certain kind of thinking over the course of our lives. It's not an either or construct. So our belief is that everyone has access to all four of these thinking approaches, and that we just have certain degrees of preference for some over others, and that has implications in terms of how we look at life, how we learn, how we look at change, how we team together, etc. So that's a little bit of background on just a very, very high level on the work and on me. I have been leading this company in a variety of ways for the last 25 years, and had my son join the organization 6 years ago to take on the day-to-day operations. And I now focus on thought leadership research and other important related kinds of tasks and supporting the work as we move forward.
Excellent. Well, we're so glad you've joined us today. So everybody, those of you who joined in a bit late, you just heard Anne Herman Nettie giving us a little bit of an orientation to the Herman Brain Dominance model, to her experience with it, her history there. So Anne, a lot of time in France. Est-ce que tu parles français?
Bien sûr.
C'est bien.
Je parle franglais aussi. No.
Oui.
My husband is French Tunisian, so we speak. It's one of the best ways to learn a language.
Well, after this is over today, Linda and I go to our French club.
So there you go. Okay,
we say we know enough French to either get into or out of trouble. So there you go. Okay, so everybody feel free to let this call be as our calls normally are. It's a little organic discussion. If you've got a question for Ann, don't hesitate to ask. And anytime you'd like to show any sort of a diagram, just let me know. In fact, I might as well right now just go ahead and promote you to a panelist. And then I think that
Great.
gives you screen control. So I've just done that. Hopefully that worked. Um, okay, so with that, let me just kind of revisit for everybody what we did on the last call. So we went over these little descriptions that we found in a variety of different images we found online. And as you no doubt know, if you do a Google search on HBDI and click on images, thousands of them come up. And some of them are obviously sourced by HBDI itself. Others, I think people have just created on a whim for whatever their purposes were. But we tend to like to just look at a variety of them just to kind of get maybe a better glimpse into what might be going on. And then our goal is to see how it overlays on the change grid. And so this is where we left off. And this is for all of you who weren't able to join us on the last call. We went over the four different, I don't call it, it's not types. What do you call them, Anne? How do you refer to these four preferences?
Quadrants. Yeah,
Four
preferences or
quadrants.
quadrants. Yeah.
Okay, so we looked at each of these quadrants and we thought, well, which energy does it resonate with on the change grid? Is it more of an outgrid energy? And for your benefit, outgrid energy would resonate with more of the driver kinds of qualities or D and disc or whatever. Although we don't, this is not a personality typing kind of a system. This is a way of looking at the variety of energies that people have around doing a task. And then we can actually profile people at the task specific level and figure out where they are on the change grid as far as performing that task is concerned and what kind of comes up characteristically about that. And we can also then determine what a better place on the change grid would be for a particular activity to be most naturally performed and performed well. And then we can talk about how you move somebody from one place to another. So we describe the change grid as being descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. And so it's really wonderful whenever we can overlay other models on top of the change grid, we get deeper and deeper understanding of what it is that we're looking at. And so what you're looking at on this particular diagram has all these different lines running all these different directions. Ignore the words for just a second. That was our attempt to place the model. But they all mean something to us. But the one that we try to begin with is just the one that talks about the four main kinds of energies that people can have from productive tension perspective. So we can have a very driver energy, which is all about getting things done. We can have a very expressive energy, which is about feeling and creativity and that kind of thing. And very in-grid is more of the amiable, supportive, caring, that sort of stuff. And then down-grid is more analytical, nuts and bolts. And it has a lot to do with the perceptions that people have about their ability in the challenge. So some of this actually goes all the way back to Yerkes and Dodson back in 1908. So what we did last time around, we said, well, you know, when we read what the I'm going to call it yellow and we had to rotate it, and we had to flip it. So in your particular depiction of things, yellow and green can stay. In fact, I'll just go to this diagram. We had to rotate this 90 degrees, no, that's not true, 45 degrees, in order to have the yellow and the green overlay. But then we had to do a vertical flip so that the red would be at the top and the blue would be at the bottom.
Sure.
We do this all the time. It's amazing what we have to do to a model, but the relative position of things, what we found after looking at all these different models, is that they tend to be very consistent. So if we can find the home base for two of these, we can generally find the home base for all four of them. And so we were able to basically say the descriptions of what goes on in yellow resonates with that outgrid energy, red upgrid, blue downgrid, green ingrid. We also added in whether it's right or left brain and whether it was more about the cerebral or limbic sorts of functions. And that's how we ended up with things as you see them right now in this little diagram. Now, we then try to figure out, well, what's its scope? Does the definitions, characteristics provided by a given model actually extend all the way to the four extremes, or is it confined to a bit tighter zone on the change grid? And so for all of you, this is a good review. This is to bring Ann up to speed because we're going to ask her a bunch of really big quiz questions that we were stumped with last time around. So she has to have her orientation to kind of do that. So Ann, if you look at these four corners where you see the red spots,
Mm-hmm.
these corners are referred to as danger zones. They're when that energy gets you in trouble
Right.
and how that ends up manifesting itself. And although you see four different of these red dots, we call them powerless points, and the one in the center is the power point. We invented that, by the way, long before Microsoft existed. We'd called it the PowerPoint. Someday we're going to have our attorneys send them a note. But these four red dots are in fact all one and the same. And so
Okay.
if you were to print the change grid out on a piece of fabric and drape it over a basketball, the power point in the center would be one pole, and these other four would drape down the sides of the ball, and we can pull them together. And that's very useful for us because when we talk about the most profoundly dysfunctional behaviors that humans can exhibit, what seems to be very much odds with one another end up being neighbors with one another. So if you ever want to learn more about the dark side of the change grid, it's a pretty fascinating place. And we all say in jest, but it really is true. All of us as business consultants and trainers and coaches kind of count our blessings that so many corporations are so deeply and profoundly screwed up, because it gives us great opportunity to go in there and try to sort things out. And so understanding the dark side of the change grid helps us to understand how things really got out of balance and why the problems that exist within companies exist. Now, I brought that up just because one of the things that we weren't able to quickly find about Herrmann brain dominance is what happens when any of these four quadrants is expressed at an extreme. So, or that individual finds himself at an extreme pressure. Now, Brian's on the call. He's our resident neuroscientist, and he would tell us well, their brain chemistry is changing, and that changes the whole game. So, but Brian, I'll ask you to chime in on that in just a second. But that's going to be one of the questions, because where we're at right now is two things. If you can see this green circle that you see there,
Mm-hmm.
this green circle,
Mm-hmm.
inside of the green circle is peace and harmony and balance and the healthiest, happiest ways that people tend to operate. And a lot of models do tend to focus more on the most positive aspects, expressions of whichever typology they happen to be mapping out. And we found our first glance of Herrmann to actually be talking about these really more healthy, functional, positive sorts of aspects. Other models actually focus entirely on the worst case scenarios, people at their ugliest. And then we can also look at this. So we kind of go like, all right, well, we know where these relatively fall. And we know that they are confined closer to the center of the change grid than they are to the extremes on the change grid. We also found out that in order to make the model overlay with greater precision, we actually have to rotate it counterclockwise 22.5 degrees. So because although your model doesn't necessarily specify it, we talk about every location having a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary energy. And when
Mm-hmm.
we talked about that tertiary energy, we needed to rotate things ever so slightly in order to get it to overlay perfectly. So that's my whirlwind orientation to what you're looking at. And so our question for you is, do you think that we're on the right track when we say that what we're understanding about the Herrmann brain dominance model is more on the looking at things from a healthy, holistic perspective, as opposed to when things start getting problematic?
That's a really interesting question. So, because we're looking at thinking, it's kind of a slightly different angle, right?
Okay.
And so the general premise of the work was just looking at how we are interacting with the world and how our thinking is perceiving, where our thinking goes when faced with a given situation. We have a few layers that I can talk about around what happens, and I would differentiate between sort of the dark side or the shadow side, right, that you were talking about, and then what happens under pressure. So one of the things that we measure in the HBDI assessment is that we actually do have sort of a day-to-day profile, which has 3 degrees of preference, a primary, a secondary, or tertiary preference for each quadrant. And we also have an under pressure profile that shows what may happen when somebody is under pressure and where their thinking might shift. So we have 2 layers of measurement that we look at. We do actually see that a large percentage of the population does shift under pressure. In many ways, they often go further out toward their preference and further away. And so if they have a low preference for, let's say, a given quadrant, that shrinks in many instances. Yes. and is favoring a stronger preference. Not always, but in most instances, as a gross generalization, that's often happening. Or it may be if there are 2 very similar preference scores in 2 quadrants, that it's a tiebreaker between those 2 under pressure. And there's clearly one that becomes much more strongly emphasized under pressure. So I would say that's, and we talk about what happens there, as that can either be positive or negative, depending on how that's showing up, right? So if I were to, I have a shadow side model, if that's helpful for you to see.
We'd love to see anything you'd care to share.
I mean, since you're bringing that up, and I guess you probably couldn't find it online, I'll go ahead and share that. Let's see, you will have to stop sharing.
I need to stop sharing.
Okay, very good. Okay, great. And it still says that I'm disabled from sharing.
Okay, let me just go back to this. I've made you a panelist. Let me go ahead and promote you to a co-host.
I think I may have to be co-host to share.
Yeah. Okay, you're now co-host, so you should be able to show whatever you like. All right,
there we go. It looks like it's letting me do that. Okay, it should be showing up there. Let's see, it's giving me the wrong slide. So let me just get to the correct slide here. All right. So do you see the shadow side? No, it's there, the shadow side of each quadrant. There you go.
Yep.
So, and I just grabbed this while you were talking, so I haven't looked at the slide for a while. So I'm assuming it's kind of
right. Join our club.
Yeah, right. But in the extreme, and if you were to look at this through sort of a shadow side, the sort of dark side of how this thinking can show up in terms of behaviors, this is how each quadrant might look. That the blue, which is the A quadrant, or as you refer to it as the upper left cerebral left, is going to be maybe locked in by the need for data and analysis, may not display emotion and may come off as very cold and aloof, may be arrogant, may not see the big picture, and may get lost in arguments around specific data, etc. May come off as intimidating or critical. The green really may want so much control that they appear to be very rigid and inflexible, may not see change happening because they're so focused on the details, may be kind of falling back on the ways things have been done before and finding it difficult to change, may appear to be judgmental because they have a very strong opinion about the way things should happen. Their desire for structure and rules may mean that they just kind of want to take control and run the show. Process may sometimes trump action, and they may, as I said earlier, miss the big picture. So that's pretty much what those 2 look like. On the right, the lower right, that lower right red quadrant, the relational quadrant as we refer to it, this can often, the person here might be emoting so strongly that they kind of get frozen up by that. They may find it very difficult to express things that are might be perceived as bad news or negative news because they're concerned about others will feel. They might make other people uncomfortable because of the degree of emotion that they feel that they must express. Their reasoning can be clouded, and their intuition may take over in such a way that logic is just not showing up. They can kind of be talking and expressing, and their need to express can kind of take over and drive some people crazy. They may actually be oversensitive to comments, and it can be a lot about them, right? Because of what they're feeling and at the moment. And then finally, that upper right experimental aspect of who we are can get lost in all of those ideas and not enough follow through, and lose people in the process, because they're way out already thinking about things that could be happening in the future, maybe not as attentive to rules or boundaries and feel pretty comfortable breaking those when that may not be appropriate. May kind of shrug off the practicality of today for the excitement of tomorrow. Desire for freedom can mean that the responsible aspects can be put to the side. The desire to kind of constantly get new can be just destabilizing for some people who they might need to work with. They can be overly optimistic. They might be only looking at their intuitive problem solving and ideas. They can be super spontaneous, which can feel impetuous. And they others may just have a hard time following where their thinking is going because they are just leaping and bounding out into the future. So that's a really, really quick and way too verbal description of the shadow side. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Absolutely perfect. In fact, let me go ahead and take the screen back for just a second, because everybody, you're about to be tested, just so you know. All right, so now I want to share my screen. Who am I? Where am I? And why? Da, 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 da. Da, da, da. I told Ann you guys were a very lively and participative group. Do prove me correct.
Well, she's so stunning that we're just listening.
There you go. Thank you, David. All right. So what I did was I took a quick screenshot of what Ann was showing us, and because I want to go back to this thing about the extremes. And so, Ann, I'm going to share a couple of things. Joseph, feel free to chime in. You don't have to just raise your hand.
I started talking, but I found that I was muted. So I'm going to stir the pot.
All right.
I'm terribly sorry I missed the last the former call, but it seems to me that the colors that you have planted on the change grid is really not according to what the explanation of Anne was. So,
but that's what we're about to. That's what we're about to dive into.
So I made a list, and I'm going to try to get it into the comments. So that was my analysis.
Oh, great! Wonderful, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. This is a fun thing. And by the way, about the colors, those of you who are familiar with other models and how they use colors, I would say to you that some might align with Herman and some may not. So, Ann, is that fair to say? It's just
absolutely. They're all over the place.
Yeah, they all never got together and decided on a uniform color pattern.
Very confusing for people.
And by the way, we all know this. If we go to other cultures, they have very different connections to what different colors mean culturally. So we just have to kind of accept any of these as being more a design choice that was being made, or perhaps there's some indication. Now, here's what I want to do. I'm going to go back to the change grid.
And by the way, we use letters as well as color because that helps when you are trying to overlay models and the colors get confusing. So that's why we have A, B, C, D on there. So that is another alternative if the colors get confusing.
Well, I thought it was interesting too, because you've chosen D for yellow. D would resonate with dominant or driver as well. So first I went like, did they give any thought to that? How was it going to resonate with other models? And I thought like, nah.
No.
So right.
No, it was A, B, C, D, like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's really what it was. It doesn't mean anything. The letters mean nothing, just A, B, C, D.
There you go. Okay, good. All right. So now, everyone, this is going to be the test. Last time around, we did look at the positive aspects of the yellow and did discover that it resonates with the overall driver energy. Remember, the driver energy ranges though from it's all on a continuum, and so it can be very gently expressed, it can be very powerfully expressed. What Ann has just gone over on the dark side, what I want you guys to do is tell me, do you find that this particular characteristic or behavior would happen between the green and the red? So that would be, and we say that inside of the green circle, everything is peaceful and happy and harmonious. Between the green and the red circle is where life gets lived. So things come into play that can be puzzling, they can be whatever. And once you're outside of the red circle, you're in trouble. And so we want to know, like, this characteristic, is it something that comes up and is actually although it might be a shadow characteristic, it's still serving a very valuable purpose given a certain set of circumstances? Or is it problematic? It's not like inherently problematic as opposed to accidentally problematic. And so that's what we want to look at. Now, one last thing for Anne's benefit is I would say to you that by overlaying it on the change grid, we can tell you a little bit about what triggered the shadow to come into play. In the case of the yellow shadow, it comes into play because the person who is being moved to that extreme perceives themselves as facing a very high level of challenge, and they view themselves as being highly able to handle that challenge. So they're moving into more of a superhero kind of a mode where they believe that there is no risk they cannot handle, and there is no one who can, begin to come close to what they're capable of doing. So it's a place of tremendous grandiose thoughts where they will often invite risk purely to prove something about themselves. As they move further and further out grid, their forget consideration of other people, their awareness that other people are even involved starts to fall by the wayside. And so if we take a look at some of these yellow shadow characteristics, and again, this is for everyone to open up and chime in on, I'm curious if you would say this is really true. So too many ideas, not enough follow through. I can certainly say to you that someone who is in the outgrid danger zone is done with ideas and is very much wanting everyone to follow through, but feels as though no one is really doing what they could and should be doing. And so they keep coming up with their own new ways of doing things. That's absolutely true. So do you guys think, is this danger zone, or is this life being lived in the world of that driver energy?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, certainly between the green and the red circles, you can tire of options and press for a decision. But if you're in the outgrid danger zone, you're done with asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're
You're
just
just
cutting
going to
the,
tell them.
yeah. And now add to that, the third bullet point does not respect rules and boundaries. Characteristic of the outgrid danger zone is the individual believes that the rules don't apply to them, but any rule they make is ironclad. And so the only rules and boundaries they respect would be their own, and only to the degree that they choose not to change them on the fly. Freedom may trump responsibility, absolutely. Yeah, well, and that's it. Overly optimistic makes bad decisions, especially financial. How many of you have got clients that are in the outgrade danger zone? Tell me if that holds true. Yeah, Boris, this is your wheelhouse.
No, I'm just in thought here. You're absolutely correct. I think they gravitate is what is coming to my mind. They gravitate from that extreme outgrid danger zone and to a place where they're able to function. And I think the most emotionally aware individuals are the ones that are able to control that the speed of their gravity. When they go out to the outgrid areas and when they pull themselves back and say, I need to take control. But this resonates quite a bit with me.
Right, because if we just look overall energetically about what Anne's put here is on the shadow side of the quadrant, I can see how a great many of these bullet points would almost be key characteristics of entrepreneurial behavior. You take that person who's the boss, the owner of the company, the whatever, their idea factories, they come in, their mind is already way down the track before they, inform others. And so they tend to leave others a little bit in the dust or wondering what's really going on. So they, by the way, I would be surprised if they said that they were relying on intuition. I think they would just more likely to say they know what they know and stop challenging them. And is this resonating at all?
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at the classic entrepreneurial profile, it has a very strong high preference in yellow.
Yeah.
So when we've done studies on entrepreneurs, they tend to be that their primary preference tends to be in yellow. If they're more technically inclined, it's yellow with some blue, right?
Sure.
But yeah, and then they become their own worst enemy in certain instances because they may or may not surround themselves with people who complement their thinking as the company grows.
Absolutely.
And this is Tim. Would you say that that's also applicable to startups?
Oh, absolutely. We
Yeah.
actually have some folks using the model with startups, and looking at early stage, and then as the business progresses, understanding in what ways can the founder or co-founders or whatever that group might be, evolve their role in such a way that the dark side of yellow gets out of the way, and they're letting some other thinking come into play so that the business can actually grow and be successful.
Yep. Thanks.
Tim's focus, by the way, is on diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that we've always talked about on the change grid is that when you have people in power who are in that danger zone or darn close to that danger zone, outgrid danger zone, these are lawsuits waiting to happen. These are individuals who don't believe the rules apply to them, and so they tend to display all sorts of behavior that, well, historically might have been considered acceptable at a certain time period, but nowadays there's, again, just waiting for all kinds of issues to arise. Sure. And so they're a very different creature to handle. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm so glad you shared. Yes,
Pardon
go ahead.
I'm sorry. And does your model accommodate development of individuals through the model to show them how to manage these quadrants?
Oh yeah. I mean, the whole premise of this work has always been, before we called it a growth mindset, in Carol Dweck's work, this notion that we know that, the brain is plastic, that people can develop and change, but it doesn't happen casually, right? Because once the patterns have been kind of established, and we do get into, our brains are lazy, so we just get into what is the sort of default mode. And so, it's when we look at what we refer to as thinking agility, and it's that ability to quickly and intentionally stretch beyond your default preferences and biases to adapt to new circumstances. And so a lot of the core work, and we also focus on cognitive diversity. We've spent quite a bit of time looking at the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging space. Are getting called to work there quite a bit right now, because this is a pretty accessible way to start talking about diversity in a way that allows everybody to kind of show up and feel like they can have a conversation without feeling threatened by, more traditional aspects. They can kind of say, okay, I can be in an in-group here that doesn't automatically exclude me. But yes, this is about development. It's about not necessarily saying that you have to change, but you don't want to be a prisoner of your preference. And so how is the preference not working for you? And in what ways can you step into other modes of thinking, either on your own or through partnership with others, to actually be more effective and neutralize what could be the shadow side of your thinking, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What I like about this, T, because I think I can see how this can help people get out of their own way. Because I think about our conscious behaviors, and when it's automated, it outsources that to the basal ganglia. So now it's no longer you consciously having to do it, you just do it. Right. So, I think about that as a physician from, doing clinical research in terms of health behaviors. No one wakes up in the morning and say, today would be a great day to experience inflammation. But yet, chronic diseases and chronic illnesses is 50% of healthcare expenditures, and it's typically 5% of the population. So that explains a lot to me. It helps me to help people understand, instead of trying to talk about neuroscience to them, just understand that, hey, you have some preferences, you have some automatic things that are going on within you. And the more they become aware of that and build that awareness, I can see how they can move out and be at least interested in getting out of their own way.
No, that's a very appropriate way to talk about it. And the TEDx talk I did that talked about the one thing you need to know about your brain that will change your life is this notion of patterning, right? And once you begin to realize, okay, maybe I have this patterning, maybe I have these default mechanisms, but I'm not trapped there forever. And we don't give people that excuse to say, oh, no, this is the way you are. So, get over it, other people. No, this is about recognizing where your thinking goes and then saying, now, how do you become more intentionally conscious in a way that allows you to override that default mechanism, which does take effort, energy, and motivation. It doesn't just happen. But this is a pretty non-threatening way to have that conversation. And frankly, my dad started the work, it was all about the brain and the brain and the brain and the brain and the brain. And I remember a manager at a large corporation saying to me years ago, one more person talks to me about my amygdala. Of course, it was ironic that he was saying that he was about the amygdala in that way. But anyway, that's so the brain is relevant to people, but they don't want to have to be a neuroscientist to understand what's going on with their life.
That's right. That's right. Well, and I think it's interesting that you're talking about that. Ultimately, this is a model that helps you to understand a bit more about yourself and others, but then it allows you to kind of appreciate what you aren't naturally aligned with and helps you to cultivate that, because that resonates with our overall belief is that every person on the planet has available to them a full change grid. But that full change grid isn't home for everyone. Over the course of our lifetimes, for whatever reasons, we've been conditioned to feel most comfortable energetically at a certain place around the change grid. We can move to any other place we need to go, but we may find that very difficult, very uncomfortable, but we can do it if we choose to put the energy into it. For our client work, there's tends to be two general destinations they want us to move people to. The most common one is they want us to move people out grid because, again, this is where the driver energy is, and mostly businesses are hiring all of us to help them become more efficient at this and that and boost their sales and all that, make things happen sort of stuff. And that happens out grid. But we're finding more and more people are engaging our services to move them to a place of centered thinking, to a place that's a little bit more appreciative, a little more holistic. And so to put it into, for your model, do you guys ever talk about people, can you develop a fully balanced brain? Edie was sharing that there's a small percentage of the population that are pretty balanced to begin with.
I think 4%, I remember learning. Is that right, Ann?
It's actually 3%. It's about 3%. I would
Well,
say
it
that,
may have gone down in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I would say this. So you can be situationally whole without changing who you are. Okay. And that is it's an interesting distinction in terms of how we approach this, which is that you can adopt habits and behaviors that allow you to be more situationally whole and get out of your own way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change your preferences in a dramatic way, right? So one of the things that is, I think, when this model really comes to life is when people can make that distinction and say, and you were talking about discomfort, and I like to believe that discomfort is the good news about discomfort is it's a sign of learning.
That's right.
And so when, is that when, that you can begin to embrace why it's important to get uncomfortable and perhaps shift a behavior or, build a habit or, get an ally or do whatever it is you need to do so that you are not sort of left as a prisoner of your preference and whatever consequences that might be. It doesn't necessarily mean that you suddenly wake up in the morning and that's something you love to do and it's, and your profile flip-flops in a different direction. That's not the point. The point's not to change your preference. The point is to understand the implications of your preference and then look at how that's working for you and then shift behaviors and learn how to embrace and step in to those other thinking modes, even if it's uncomfortable, even if we don't feel like we have thinking skills there, those can be developed. And that's really the core message of what we teach.
Excellent. Excellent.
You
Other questions?
know what, T?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, there's one thing I hope we cover before the end. I remember, Ann, you said that I was so far right-brained that under stress, I went off the charts. And I would like to, T, if we could do some comparison that when we talk about, being high stress on the change grid, and what that means with, Anne, you said, that we also have how we are under stress. If we could do some comparison there, I think it'd be interesting.
Absolutely. I'll do, let me add one more layer to what's going on so we
Okay.
can talk about that. That has to do with the engagement rings. And so, based on where people plot on the change grid, we can tell you whether they are in an awareness kind of a mode, if they've formulated an intention, if they're engaged in doing what really needs to be done, if they're executing on whatever is there. You can see these more causative sorts of words about intention, engagement, execution tend to be more on the out grid, or resonate more with the yellow quadrant, or the D quadrant there. Now, to Edie's point, Edie, I don't know what you tested out as, but I would not be surprised if it was heavy on the red side of things.
Yeah. Red and yellow. I was totally lopsided. Yeah.
But that's fine. Yeah, then that's all fine, because now let's talk about how that would overlay on the change grid, and let's all decide if this explains the Edie we know and love. So that would mean that the red energy tends to resonate more, or sorry, the red quadrant tends to resonate more with the levels of tension, stress, power stress, and a good part of upper power. So there's a sense of urgency associated with this particular area of the change grid, this idea that something needs to be done, it needs to be done now. It can be rather impulsive, etc. But living up grid is what it's really all about. Now, what's driving that is these perceptions that the challenge is greater than the perceived level of ability to meet those challenges. And so there are puzzles to be solved, and there's strategies that have to be very quickly mobilized, or there's opportunities that suddenly appear that we have to do something to take advantage of. So that whole idea about fear of missing out tends to live very much up grid as well. So let's take a look at the shadow side of things and see how this holds true. So I like possible non-flattering. That's a very good way to put it. Feeling others' pain so deeply they can't take appropriate actions. That would be very much the upgrade danger zone. Not only could they feel others' pain, they could also be feeling their own in that situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Struggle to deliver bad news. They're champions at avoidance behaviors. So that's good. Can be too emotional. That makes others uncomfortable. Yeah. Edie, I love you to pieces.
God, I'm so relating to this.
I'm just saying, reasoning can often be clouded by feelings. Now, again, I think that for you, that's being balanced out a bit more, because you do have a lot of those driver elements as well. So Edie never gets excited and stays there. For Edie, it always translates into action. Possibilities come into play, action starts to be taken. And so I think that's this D quadrant also coming into play there. What's going on? So benefit of the doubt. I don't know about boundaries, but yeah, that would definitely happen. In fact, Anne, we say that this area of the change grid between your red and your yellow, our up grid and out grid, this is the world of romance and schmoozing. This is where everyone tries to work the deal if it's a business setting, but this is also where all kinds of mating rituals end up occurring. So this is where people get very flirtatious. And we have a tool called the Comprehensive Adjective Map. So at every one of these intersections, there's a list of up to 10 unique adjectives that describe what's going on at that exact coordinate pair. Well, right there is the adjective smooth, and smooth is spelled with 5 O's. So the person is real smooth. Yeah, so they're working it all out. So, but that's, I think, Edie, that talks about this balance element. You don't just get upgrid about things. Your upgrid energy compels you to move from just being aware of something to actually formulating some sort of an intention, and that intention then moves you to engagement. And what's driving that is as your perception of your ability continues to increase, or as you start doing the work to develop the knowledge, skill, experience, approach, whatever, that's moving you further and further away from that reactive part of being up-grid to the more proactive way of operating more out-grid. You're, instead of feeling out of control up-grid, you're seizing control, or trying to do precisely that. And that's why one of the things I wanted to just share with everybody is that when we're talking about these the shadow side of things and the essential side of things, when I think of anything inside of the green circle, I think of a bright sunshiny day. These are all the things in their best possible light. When we go between the green and the red, well, it's getting later in the day now, and there starts to become a little bit of darkness starts to come into play. That's between the green and the red circle. There's work to be done, life to be lived, issues to be dealt with, experience to be had. But once you get beyond that red circle, now you're in darkness. And that's where the real problems end up lying. So when I think about a lot of what Anne has presented here as being the shadow side, some of it starts to feeling a little bit like dusk is coming, because I think that a great many of these characteristics, given a certain set of circumstances, could end up being a positive sort of thing, as long as it doesn't go too far into the darkness.
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really pushing the, like, how could this work in a negative way?
Yeah.
But we focus primarily, and this is actually not something we don't spend a lot of time on the shadow side, because people tend to glom onto that and immediately start making assumptions about the quadrants as being negative.
Yeah.
So we actually tend to focus on what are all the upsides. So the strengths of each quadrant
Yep.
is is just basically, if you flip this, that's what you get.
Yeah, and that's exactly where what we like to do as well. Again, we depict it differently, but life is an untidy thing. And so we always want to be able to celebrate that what under certain circumstances could be negative, like, for example, relying on intuition and not logic. Well, that intuition could very well save the day.
Yes.
Given a certain set of circumstances. So we'd like to say all of these things, every location on the change grid, every possibility is inherently good. So, or our way of looking at it from more of a psycho-spiritual kind of a place is that we've all been gifted with every location on this change grid, because that location and what comes along with being at that location could serve us very well, given a certain set of circumstances. That said, that exact same location on the change grid could be deeply problematic otherwise. In fact, we often say everyone wants to be in the center of the change grid. The center of the change grid is a place of we talk about great detachment from what's going on. You can observe everything, but you can and appreciate everything. You're at peace, you're balanced, you're all that kind of stuff. Well, that's really great, but is that the human experience?
Right.
Everybody wants to go on vacation, and they go like, all I want is to lay on the beach and read a book. So day one, they're on the beach reading the book, going like, oh, this is perfect. Well, by day two and day three, they're kind of going, is there nothing else to do on this island?
Yeah, right.
So we want to recharge our batteries, but then we want to get back to life. And life is not lived in the center of the change grid. Only, it's a wonderful thing. Meditation can take us there, and all those good sorts of practices can take us there, but it's taking us there for a reason. And that's to help us become better at living whatever life throws our way. And sometimes we say life may very well throw a yellow situation at us, or a blue situation. And we got to be able to be flexible enough to respond in a way that serves us all well from that.
Just for the sake of, if you could let me have, I'd like to share the
you
strengths
still
model.
can. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and stop
just to share what we typically would focus on, just so that you get that as part of the picture, since we jumped into the shadow side pretty quickly, because that was your question. But we focus also on what are the strengths. And so what are the things that what's the upside of each of these
Mhm.
quadrants. And you can see that this is that flipping of, the ability in the yellow is to tolerate ambiguity, is to see possibilities, is to process simultaneously. In the red, it's being able to sense what's going on with somebody else, which can be hugely important to engage people, to, generate enthusiasm. On the green, it's all about finding the things that are broken, understanding, creating
Mhm.
some stability and being able to kind of keep things on track and get things done. And then in the blue, it's all about that ability to really bring the logic to bear, do the analysis that's required, understand technical elements, and then, be that number cruncher. So those are just, I just wanted to share that very quickly as being the other side of things, which is really where we focus most and where we start with most people, if that makes sense.
It does. It absolutely does. And in fact, could you go ahead and restore that that
Sure,
graphic?
absolutely. Sure, absolutely.
Because
Go right ahead.
here's our other question for you. We were bouncing around. Could you, if we said that these characteristics, as you've listed here, all exist on a continuum.
Mhm.
And so reading the signs of coming change isn't an all or nothing thing. There's, there's
Right.
degrees to which that can all be done. We would say that there is a certain place on the change grid where each of these things occurs best. And so to kind of help us as we give our thoughts to that, could you tell us what the exact center of your diagram looks and feels like?
So when you have all four.
When you have all four in perfect balance and harmony, the perfect brain, if it even exists.
Well, we actually don't say that because we find that people get kind of hung up on it. It's like, well, I need to be whole, and it's like, well, you can be.
And you can work
It's
toward
that
it. Yeah.
For us, and I'll stop sharing for just a moment. And this is probably not going to be exactly what you want, but I'll share. Let me just flip to another model here. It's, I'm going to say this, which is, from my perspective, it's that ability to have that flexing. And so when we see people who are naturally whole brained, it's their ability to step in and out of these different, without getting trapped in one.
Yes.
Now, the downside of a whole brain profile is that there can be almost a wishy-washy factor because
Absolutely.
you're not anchored to any one of these, and you kind of get bored really easily and you don't want to go deep. But that's, I would say that, it's that coming back to that being agile in your thinking is the place where we are in the middle. And so it's the integration of these in a way that most effectively can solve problems, make decisions, communicate, engage with others, and do that in a way that has the inherent sort of mental flexibility that allows you to kind of truly benefit from your own cognitive diversity, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that resonates very, very much with what we're talking about for the center of the change grid. And we don't need to switch the diagrams to do this because I think everyone on the call will understand what I'm saying. When we are at the center of the change grid, and again, we go there deliberately, we don't just stand there squarely in the middle. We have a tendency to lean one direction or another. And so I love this idea about changing the color of the lens, because if I'm standing at the exact center of the change grid, I could be leaning slightly out grid, which is a very different let's say focus, if you will, than if I'm leaning a bit up grid, more in the expressive direction, or in grid, more on the amiable, or down grid, more on the analytical. It is this ability to quickly move to whatever direction or see things from whatever perspective that best serves you in that moment. So Anne, we talk about that to move yourself to the center of the change grid. And I think it's interesting that certain people find themselves there naturally, but we say that that individual has the unique ability to naturally practice what we call the art of caring detachment. So they're able to be in a situation, but at the same time be able to emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, perhaps even physically separate themselves from whatever it is that's actually going on around them.
Hmm.
And that gives them more of a ability to see everything from all the different angles. So then when they rejoin the group back on Earth, if you will, they're able to perhaps give some insights and some guidance and some understanding that helps everyone else to gain greater clarity.
That's fascinating. I actually like that notion of
Yep.
the art of caring detachment.
Caring
That's
detachment, the art of caring
interesting.
detachment.
Yeah, and it's
Well,
that we call those stop and think moments where you step and you stop and you get back and you step back and you look at to what degree, where is my thinking, number one,
Right,
where is it
right.
taking me? And then how might I need to begin to look at what is the most effective shift that I
Yeah.
could make in this particular situation. So that's kind of how we refer to that.
We bring it up because we believe that every one of us in the human development industry has to become very skilled at practicing the art of caring detachment. We have to be able to go into any of our client situations and not have our own agenda or whatever, but to be able to go in and rather than get sucked into whatever their drama is, we can practice that art of caring detachment so that we can gather information from whatever sources are available to us, and we can seek to understand where everyone is coming from, what everyone's doing. And from that awareness that comes from that act of caring detachment, we can then re-enter the actual dialogue and say, here's what it is that we have to share, what we see, what we think, whatever it happens to be. And so I think that cultivating that ability to practice that art of caring detachment is of vital importance to anyone and everyone who is touching other humans' lives, because there's a certain responsibility that we have. And that's to make sure that we don't impose our agendas on other people, but instead help them to better understand and pursue whatever theirs are.
Well, I have a quick thing I'd love to share and get your
Please do.
reaction to, since when we look at change, and Edie, I don't know if you remember this model or if it even existed when you were last connected with us, but we have a whole bunch of stuff that we do that applies to change. And part of our construct around change is that every preference actually looks at it differently.
Yes.
And needs different things. And so when we look at org change, we feel that that the most successful approach is actually going to hit all 4 quadrants.
Yes.
And that when you eliminate any one of those, you start to get the kinds of outcomes that we often see in change efforts, right?
That's right.
So I don't know if this resonates with your work, but I thought I would just share it as one of our overlays that people find most helpful as they think about change as it relates to, and so when you're not paying it, so it really requires a whole brain approach basically to be most successful. So
well, and I think
just thought I'd
to what
share
you're
that.
saying, basically, unless we have the ability to move into each of these quadrants and spend some real genuine time with each one of them, honoring what they bring to the table and all that, we're going to end up with information that was incomplete and inaccurate. And if we end up trying to make some sort of decision based on incomplete, inaccurate information, our solution is going to be incomplete and inaccurate. And so why do we need to like jump down the timeline and then suddenly realize, oh, this obstacle exists, and oh, we should have known that, and blah. Why can't we stop for a moment? Again, this is part of that art of caring detachment, and say, before we move any direction, let's make sure that we've stopped for a moment to appreciate whatever it is that's really going on in the whole picture. One last thing I'd like to comment on, and then I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I want to make sure anyone who has a question can have a quick opportunity to ask it. But this idea about someone who is actually stuck in the middle, whose whole life is a life of detachment, that is not something that anyone would want to aspire to, because now you exist, but you're not living. Maybe you can be, we talk about the oracle of the self, helping you to better talk to you about you. Maybe they're very skilled at all that, but they're not really living their own life. They're just in the world, but not of it. They let the winds of heaven dance around them. They're too separate And there's no learning that goes on there. There's no change that happens there. There's no growth that goes on there. And that's why we sometimes wonder, these people who have devoted their entire life to finding and living at the center of the change grid, and whether that's a Buddhist monk or you name whatever pursuit it might be, you go, what is that life really all about? Would you want that life? And that's, so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, that we don't view that permanently residing at the center of the change grid is particularly desirable.
Well, I do have a hard stop at the hour, so I just want to leave anybody who has any questions, or if you want to learn more, I have a really super simple email address. It's just ann@hbdi.com, ann@hbdi.com. I'll put it in chat if you have very specific questions that you couldn't get to today, because I know this was kind of running left and right and all over the place, but happy to entertain those or have another dialogue if this was helpful. I hope this provided some clarity for you.
Absolutely. And we thank you very much for joining us. So everyone, will continue this discussion on Tuesday. So think about what Ann has shared, and you're always welcome to join us. I know you're busy, but the Circle of Brilliance is a wide open opportunity, and nothing would make us happier than to have you pop in. And so we'll make sure that we keep you on the invite list. The registration link never changes. It's always the same. So, but this is Tuesdays and Thursdays at this exact same time.
Perfect. Great.
That's
a wonderful, wonderful booster.
Yeah, you will be the subject of discussion on Tuesday, just so you know.
My ears will be burning. Maybe I should show up.
Maybe you should show up. Yeah. Okay. All right, everybody. Again, join me in thanking Ann. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Ann.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.